Hello and welcome to the 8th part of the BMS modding tutorial series. In this part 1 we'll discuss the implementation of 3D cockpits in Falcon BMS. In this introduction part 8.0 I will provide you with a general overview about how 3D cockpits are implemented in BMS, what files are required, or impacted, and where you can find them. I will follow up with a practice exercise on how to transfer a 3D cockpit from one database to another, whether from a previous BMS version to a new one, or from one theater to another.
Okay, so what files are needed for a 3D cockpit? Inevitably, you need the respective 3D model and corresponding textures. These are as explained in part 3 about the database basics in the Teradata objects models subfolder with the numbered model folders, and of course for BML version 1 models texture files are located under Korea OBJ, and if high resolution versions of the same textures exist, they are located under Korea OBJ high res. In fact, the vast majority of 3D cockpits comprises multiple separate models with corresponding textures. These are complementary models, so you may have a separate model for the cockpit shell, primary cockpit model for the consoles and panels, one for the switches and indicators, and possibly one for night lighting. And you can also have other separate models such as the canopy model, the cockpit legs or pilot model as you want to call it. And in the meantime, there are even complementary virtual reality models available. So BMS is very flexible in this respect, and if you intend to create a new 3D cockpit, you have also a lot of flexibility when it comes to the number of models that you actually want to use. One of the big advantages of separate complementary models is that you can reuse some of that stuff, so some of these models for other cockpits as well, especially if you want to create a cockpit for an aircraft of which there are multiple variants or versions available, and there are variations in the cockpit, so some common parts such as a canopy, for example, can then simply use the dedicated canopy model, so you don't need to include it in your primary cockpit model, for example, and simply source it from a separate model file. That's a big advantage. The techniques I have shown you how to find a 3D model in BMS in general under part 4 about the 3D model viewer and how to find the 3D models for database objects and their corresponding textures do not apply to cockpits, for the reason that cockpits are not a database item as such, but the models and textures are located in the same folders. So how do you find a particular cockpit? Generally spoken, this brings us already to the next part. In the art and CKPT art or cockpit art folder, you find the cockpit folders for individual aircraft. These contain two files, the so-called 3D ckpit.dat file and the 3D buttons.dat file. Then you have the 3D ckpit.dat file. This is essentially, let's call it the source file, similar to a class table record entry in the database on database objects. Herein you define not only various 3D cockpit related parameters, particularly important part for us in this case are the cockpit model numbers. As you can see here already 5 different models, so 2 cockpit models, one dedicated cockpit canopy model, one HUD model, and the cockpit wings model. As a side note, the cockpit wings model is, so to speak, the external aircraft model visible from the cockpit. It's typically derived from the main external 3D model of an aircraft, but you can also have a separate dedicated model, but this may not always make sense. It may make sense if the external 3D model and the cockpit model itself are not properly aligned. In such a case, a separate cockpit wings model may make sense, but the typical approach is to simply cut away some of the cockpit stuff from the external 3D model so that it doesn't interfere with the primary cockpit model, and that's then the version that you will use. So, and once you have identified the model numbers, then you can of course simply browse to your Teradata objects, model subfolder, search for them if you want to transfer it to another database, then you have to transfer them. Let's take a look in particular at the EF2000 cockpit. It's named EF2000. In this case, those 3 files here at the bottom are just development files, so you can ignore them. In the release version of the EF2000 data mod, there will be only these 2 files, the 3D CKPITAT and 3D buttonstat. And if we take a look in here now, we see we have the cockpit model, another cockpit model, cockpit HUD model, cockpit canopy model, and the cockpit legs model. This is a standard one used by the F-16, so that one should be available in 4.38 by default anyway. I may replace it with a customized version, mainly to implement the dedicated NEBO checklists for the EF2000 aircraft, but that's something that I will do at a later point. So we have, for the moment, those 3. In theory, also the cockpit wings model. It's not quite up here for the simple reason that the EF2000 cockpit folder is shared by 5 different EF2000 variants in EF2000 Retro. For EF2000 data, it will be shared by 2 variants. So the cockpit wings model is defined differently in this case, but it simply depends on how you set it up. So the first step for you, if you want to transfer a cockpit from one database to another, is to find the corresponding cockpit folder under art, CKPT art, and then you can copy paste that cockpit folder to another database. In this case, EF2000 data doesn't have its own cockpit folder, so it sources all the cockpits from the stock KTO art CKPT art folder. The reason why I've adopted this approach in particular for this mod is because I only have one 3D cockpit that I would like to add. So I'm pointing to the default KTO art CKPT art folder. I will now simply copy paste this folder over here. Of course, these files would be deleted for a release version as they are not required. So we have the cockpit folder in, and that we simply open this file, check out the model numbers required, and you can go to the Teradata objects models folder, and in this case, if you have seen, it's models 11,000 through 11,003. So we only pick these 3 ignoring the cockpit lex model, which should be included anyway. And in this case, we place it within the EF2000 data, tear data objects folder, because we are using a dedicated 3D objects folder in EF2000 data. And we also need to copy paste the cockpit wings model. This is done here and also here. I will show you in a minute how you will find that one. And if you know essentially the cockpit model numbers, you can of course look them up here in the EF2000 retro database so that you are able to find the corresponding textures that are displayed in the bottom left corner. So you can see it's a BML version 1 format which has numbered texture files that are located under Korea OBJ. In this case, we have a total of 6 texture files. Looking for 11,000. Okay, this is 11,000 through 11,005. And then we copy it over to Korea OBJ. And that's it. Basically, what I wanted to show you in this respect is where the cockpit wings model is in this case defined, and that's within the aircraft data file. So for the EF2000, let's enlarge it. You simply open the corresponding txt pb file, search for cockpit. So here you have the cockpit folder name defined, and here is the cockpit wings model number defined. Okay, so it's not a must, but it is one of the options how to create a cockpit folder name. In this case, you can flexibly name it as you want. And if you have different variants or versions of a particular aircraft type and only want one cockpit folder, then it makes sense to define the same name here and the cockpit wings parent below, so you can also cover, for example, in this case, the corresponding wings models to all the different EF2000 operators that are represented in EF2000 Retro or also in EF2000 data. Of course, if you have different versions of the same aircraft types that are using a common aircraft data file, as it is the case with the EF2000 aircraft in the stock KTO, so both German and British aircraft that are included in stock KTO are using a single aircraft data file, EF2000 txt pb. In this case, if you have just one such aircraft data file, you have to adopt a different approach in case that you want to use a cockpit for an aircraft. And this approach would be that you create 2 cockpit folders under art ckpt art. Okay, so one for the German, one for the British variant, and you place the 3D ckpt and 3D buttons in there, and in each of them you would then need to define the cockpit wings model number, so the line can be copy pasted in here with whatever correct model number. You can possibly must also include in this case the main model number of the external aircraft 3D model. This ensures that the corresponding cockpit and related cockpit wings model are showing up correctly when you fly a particular aircraft. But in such a case, specific naming conventions need to be obeyed for naming the cockpit folder itself. That's very important. Only if you define the name within the aircraft data file, you can select whatever name you want, so to speak. But there are up to 4 naming conventions in total. The aforementioned one and the other 3 require you to take a look at the aircraft's vehicle control data record entry. Let's simply take the British variant here. On one hand, you could use the vehicle name displayed here, so to speak, the database name of the aircraft. That's also used for the user interface. If you name a cockpit folder EF2000BS, it's, so to speak, the identification. Okay, if I enter the EF2000BS in them, it would appropriately use the data from the equivalent named cockpit folder under art CKPT art. The second naming convention is using the NCTR cockpit code displayed here, in this case EF. But if you have different variants of the aircraft, that's a little bit problematic if all of them should use the same cockpit, because in this case you have only one cockpit wings model that you point to. In such a case, it would be more appropriate if you have separate aircraft data files as well, to simply take the approach that I've shown you. And the final naming convention is simply determined by the external aircraft's model number. So in this case, 1120 would be the main aircraft model number. So you name the cockpit folder 1120, and this establishes the link to the particular British EF2000 aircraft. Okay. In such a case, you, of course, if you have multiple variants of the aircraft, you would need to create multiple cockpit folders, duplicate the 3D ckpit.3d buttons files, and edit the 3D ckpit file to point to the correct cockpit wing model, and possibly also main model aircraft number. I'm not sure whether the latter is actually required if you are using the naming conventions vehicle name or main model number, but it may of course be of relevance if you are using the EF code. In this case, the NCTR cockpit code, in this case EF. So that's it. Essentially, we have now created the cockpit folder already. I've already included in both aircraft data files the corresponding cockpit name EF2000 and pointed to the respective models. And we should have transferred all of the relevant cockpit textures. That's correct. And also the models 11,000 through 11,003 plus 10 for the British cockpit wings model and 11 for the German cockpit wings model. In this case, the cockpit wings models are derived from the external 3D models and point to the same texture, so we don't need to include the cockpit wings model textures in this case. So all that's then essentially left to do is to launch the game and perform a verification check that everything works as expected. So as you can see, it is not really difficult to transfer a 3D cockpit. The only thing that you may stumble across, however, is that if you don't have the source model file, you cannot change the texture assignments in the model itself. So while you can easily rename the numbered model folder, in this case you would need to update the model numbers in the 3D cockpit file for the respective models. That's possible, but if those models are calling up specific texture files and these are already in use by another model in a new database, then you run into troubles. And thus far, I'm not aware of any tool or possibility to change the texture number assignments. That's only of relevance for BML version 1 formats. So you either have the source model file, or in the case you have an old lot model file, then you can use tools such as texture set editor or the lot editor tool, which allow you to change the texture file assignments of a 3D model, but that's only possible if it's an older model in the original lot format. And then you could in theory use the lot model to BML version 1 model conversion feature included in the BMS editor. Under the model steps there's a convert button. Here, and in this case you would only browse a lot model and then could click on open, and it would simply create the BML version of it. That error message was just being shown because I can see it's a process, but of course it may also be displayed if the model has a problem, something's wrong within the lot model files, and it may happen that the converter fails to convert this model to the BML format. Okay, so we have seen that this process is anything other than complex. It's quite easy, but with a constraint: if you don't have the appropriate source file, you may not be able to change the texture numbers. With a bit of luck, those texture numbers are not in use by a new database, but if you are unlucky, they are in use, and then you cannot use a cockpit, or you have to accept that some other object may have weird looking textures. In such a case, it would of course be possible to simply check out which object is affected. If it's maybe just a feature or building somewhere in the landscapes that you are unlikely to see at all, then it might be acceptable to you, but that's up to your own decision. It's not that I recommend this, but if you have no other way, then it may be necessary, and you have to weigh whether it's more important to you to get the cockpit over or not. Okay, then that's it for this lesson. In the next subparts of part 8, I will dive a little bit deeper into the cockpit files and also the 3D cockpit itself. So see you next time with the next video. Bye.